Before I get into today's episode, let's talk about a problem. If you just do a quick Google search of maybe new podcast recommendations 2022, you'll probably find 1,000 listicles that look exactly the same and have the exact same suggestions. So how do we solve that problem? Earbuds Podcast Collective. That's how. Earbuds Podcast Collective is a newsletter that will give you themed recommendations curated by some of the podcast space's best creators. You'll find recommendations for big shows, small shows, popular shows, or shows that you didn't even know existed. I promise that if you give it a try, you'll find a show that might become your next second favorite show, because obviously, this is your first. Again, that's Earbuds Podcast Collective. Last week I told you about America's first megachurch leader, an eccentric woman from Canada named Aimee Semple McPherson. I told you about her revolutionary strategies, her national reputation as a faith healer, and her very mysterious disappearance. After she vanished, her congregation, the state of California, and the nation prepared to mourn her loss. But before they could hold a proper funeral, Sister Aimee reappeared, thousands of miles away, just as mysteriously as she disappeared. My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. The sun scorched the desert floor on a blistering June day. The southern border of the United States looked like a bleached strip in a vast brown wasteland. In spite of God and nature, there were dozens of cities that dotted this swath of hostile land. Brownsville, Las Cruces, Yuma, Sonora, many others. On this particular June day, while the other border cities were abustle with their regular activity, people living ordinary lives, cars slithering their way through concrete mazes, laughter, tears, pain, and joy. While those cities were alive with simple existence, Agua Prieta, though it didn't know it, was about to be wrapped up in one of America's hottest scandals and most intriguing mysteries. Aimee Semple McPherson stumbled out of the Mexican desert, her bright white shoes tarnished with dirt. Step by staggered step, she marched forward from an unknown location towards the closest civilization she could find. Her trek ended when she collapsed, face down, baking in the desert sun. A couple, Ramon and Teresa Gonzalez, saw her and quickly tended to her after she collapsed. They took her into their home, stabilized her condition, and let her rest on their couch. And when she finally awoke, she told them a harrowing tale. While out for a swim, Sister Aimee alleged that a young couple approached her, asking for a favor. They pleaded with her to lay hands upon their sick child and heal them. Never wanting to disappoint, Sister Aimee followed the young couple to their car. They directed her to a bundle of clothes in the back seat and assured her that the child was nestled into it. And as she leaned into the car, cautiously, she was shoved into the vehicle, restrained, and then a damp rag was placed over her face, and the world went dark, utterly and completely. When she awoke, she was in a small room with the windows boarded. Small slivers of bright light poured in, giving her a vague sense of time. She was detained there for days. In those first few days, she was tended to only by a woman going by the name of Rose, who seemed to have medical training. Staying ever present, Sister Aimee learned as much about her captors as possible. She knew her captors' names, Steve, Rose, and Felipe, and that they wanted to leverage her life for a healthy ransom check. She also learned that she was not their only target. Her captors had also made plans to kidnap other notable Hollywood celebrities, and even their children. After the first few days, they began to torture Sister Aimee, trying to get personal information from her. In her testimony, Sister Aimee alleged that one of the men burned her with a cigar, but eventually stopped because he felt bad about hurting an innocent person. Eventually, the team of kidnappers bound Sister Aimee and loaded her into a car. They took her from the boarded-up house to a shack somewhere in a remote desert. After a few days in the shack, held there against her will, Sister Aimee decided to make a break for it. She carefully observed the routines of her captors, and when they were out running errands, she made her move. Using the lid of a tin can, she cut through the ropes that bound her wrists. She then pried open one of the shack's windows, crawled through, and fled as quickly as possible. At first, she was fueled by adrenaline, moving quickly through the featureless desert. But she soon realized that she was hopelessly lost. There was no city visible, no houses, no sign of life, save for her own quickening heartbeat and her blistered and bruised skin. Sister Aimee decided to walk toward the only feature she could see, a small mountain. She walked for days in the desert, using her dress as shade from the sun. During her journey, she did everything in her power to avoid cacti, dangerous animals, and other desert hazards. But she wasn't entirely successful. Cacti needles pricked into her legs, stiff branches of brush poked holes in her dress, and the dust caked her pores. Still, she staggered forth until she saw signs of civilization. From the inky desert darkness emerged an amber glow of streetlights. Sister Aimee, on shaking legs, pulled herself to the city. Elation gripped her heart as she saw houses and roads and businesses. She nearly pounded on the first door that she saw, but she was scared off by the family's dog, so she continued farther and farther and farther into the city until she collapsed and awoke in the care of Ramon and Teresa. And that's the story. At least, according to Sister Aimee. She was taken back to Los Angeles by train, and when she arrived, it's reported that there were 50,000 people there waiting for her. Adoring fans, congregation members, skeptics, police, medical staff, and most of all, journalists. They followed her back to Angelus Temple, and in fact, the parade back to the temple elicited a greater turnout than President Woodrow Wilson's visit to Los Angeles in 1919. This only further cemented her legacy as a premier Hollywood celebrity. Despite the warm welcome and celebration, Sister Aimee's fantastical tale was about to be scrutinized by tens of thousands of people. And just as in all things, the truth is unclear and difficult to find. Though her return was celebrated by her followers and fans, it was not universally popular. Sister Aimee's influential public stance on evolution and the Bible made enemies out of most of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, as well as other civic leaders who saw her return as a gaudy display, embarrassing to the city on a national scale. Many Los Angeles area churches were also annoyed. To them, Sister Aimee was a newcomer, an immigrant who blew into their town on a great northern wind and set up shop, robbing from them the business that they had spent years, or even generations, establishing. She was the shiny new toy, and her highly publicized disappearance, death, return, and reports of kidnapping only further separated her from the rest of the rabble. Every church in Los Angeles had a pastor, priest, minister, reverend, father, or teacher. But there was only one Sister Aimee, only one celebrity preacher, only one religious leader in Los Angeles who, much like Christ himself, died and returned again. The Chamber of Commerce, together with Reverend Robert T. Schuller, leading the Los Angeles Church Federation, as well as the Associated Press, formed a League of Truth Seekers, an unofficial alliance to determine if her disappearance was caused by something other than kidnapping. and the ensuing legal battle was scandalous, salacious, and dramatic in a way that is only fitting for a Hollywood film. But before we get to the second act of this episode, we have to pay the bills, so hang tight and get ready for a wild ride. I'll be back in about 90 seconds with the conclusion of this unbelievable story. It was immediately clear that there was a case to be had, but nobody could quite figure out what kind of case there was. Obviously, there was a kidnapping, but Sister Aimee could give no reasonable identity to her captors, and the case was opened against Steve Doe, Rose Doe, and John Doe. The identity of these people would never really be learned, despite the rigorous investigation and interrogation spearheaded by District Attorney Asa Keys. The first inquiry focused on the belief that the disappearance was a plot to elicit money for a memorial fund commemorating Sister Aimee's death. Keys claimed that Sister Aimee was a charlatan, a fraudster whose mission was monetary rather than holy. After deliberation, it was determined that there was insufficient evidence to prove that there was a kidnapping, or that Sister Aimee was intentionally faking her disappearance for monetary gain. The second inquiry alleged that rather than faking a kidnapping for monetary gain, Sister Aimee faked a kidnapping to cover up a tantalizing affair with a man named Kenneth Ormison, who had been her close friend and radio operator at Angelus Temple for a time. After piecing together some loose evidence and testimony, Asa Keys alleged that the two lovebirds had run off to a resort town named Carmel by the Sea to enjoy their extramarital affair in peace. The inquiry stalled due to lack of evidence and ended by mid-August. However, it was reopened later when a defense witness, Lorraine Wiseman Sylaf, sided with the prosecution as a betrayed co-plotter. According to Wiseman Sylaf, she introduced herself to McPherson and declared that she had been in Carmel as a nurse for her twin sister, who was Ormison's mistress. Because the twins somewhat physically resembled McPherson, they were being misidentified as her. McPherson embraced Wiseman Sylaf as an important witness who could exonerate her, and for a time, she was a guest at the Angelus Temple parsonage. Ormiston also signed a letter around September 8th that his companion was a sister of Wiseman Sylaf, confirming her initial story. However, later, Wiseman Sylaf was caught passing bad checks and blamed it on her twin. Essentially, Ormiston was in Carmel by the Sea with a woman who was known only as Miss X. At first, it was alleged that Miss X was Wiseman Sylaf's sister. Then it was alleged that it was Sister Aimee, until later, still, Wiseman Sylaf alleged that Miss X had been one of her other older sisters. The longer that the case drug on, the less reliable Wiseman Sylaf became. At every turn she disrupted the case. She accused members of the defense of sexual impropriety, and when her own checkered past was brought into question, she passed the blame onto others, which only extenuated the trial. In the end, she provided nothing of substance to the case, and only extended it by a number of weeks, costing over $100,000. Though Wiseman Sylaf turned out to be a dud of a witness, she wasn't the only person alleging that they had seen Sister Aimee in the resort town. Jeanette Parks, who lived next door to Ormiston's cottage, claimed that she saw passing glimpses of a woman wearing a cap and goggles at no closer than 25 feet, with one sighting estimated as long as 2 minutes. Later, through the kitchen window, she said she noticed that the woman had a mass of red hair piled up on her head. In the trial, Mrs. Parks was asked to identify the woman she saw in Ormiston's cottage. At that point, Sister Aimee was asked to remove her hat, exposing her red hair. At the sight, Mrs. Parks laughed and said, "That's her." Parks's husband, Percy, gave testimony as well. In his recollection, he saw a woman matching Sister Aimee's description for about 30 seconds without a hat or goggles. He also attested that the mystery woman was Sister Aimee, after seeing her during the trial. However, for every witness that placed Sister Aimee at Ormiston's cottage, there were others who confirmed that Ormiston's mistress, or mistresses, were not the celebrity preacher. Stonemason William McMichaels testified that he saw Miss X more times than all the other witnesses put together, as he had been repairing the fence of the cottage during Ormiston's stay. He said that he was within 10 feet of the woman at the bungalow on several occasions, and he certified that McPherson was not the woman that he saw. Ernest Renkert, who delivered a load of wood to the cottage, also claimed to see Ormiston's mistress. Though he had been called in to testify, he held fast to his story that the woman he saw was not over 25, and that the woman he saw at Carmel by the Sea was blonde. McPherson was over 35 and had auburn hair. In court, Renkert stated, "When I see a woman, I look at her," which elicited laughter from the jury and even Sister Aimee herself. Finally, the landlord of the cottage, H.C. Benedict, wrote on the back of a photo of McPherson that there was nothing about it that reminded him of the woman who was with Ormiston. Though he had faced pressure from the prosecution to identify her as one of Mr. Ormiston's mistresses, he wouldn't be budged. He stated that he had a whole squad of them up there, and they were pulling these photographs saying, "Do you recognize this?" and another one saying, "Do you recognize that?" For what it's worth, and what was perhaps the final straw for this particular argument, Mr. Ormiston did admit under oath to having an extramarital affair. Only it wasn't with Sister Aimee. However, he did not identify his lover. Despite these very weak investigations, Judge Samuel R. Blake was set to try Sister Aimee, her mother, and several other defendants in a jury trial case in Los Angeles, set for mid-January 1927. If convicted, the counts added up to a maximum prison time of 42 years. The trial fizzled out before it could begin, though. Neither side could do much to prove their cases. Sister Aimee couldn't do anything to prove that she had been kidnapped. In fact, there was plenty of evidence to suggest that she hadn't been. Mexican officials asserted that McPherson could not have been taken across the border against her will because it was patrolled with a strict watch by both nations, and that special police had been assigned to all border towns immediately after McPherson's disappearance was announced. Mexican officials also couldn't find anyone fitting the description of Felipe that Sister Aimee mentioned in her testimony. Now, it may be unreasonable to find a particular Felipe, but since she described him as a huge hulking man, and as old Felipe of Mexico City who was in charge of a narcotics and human trafficking ring, it's not unreasonable to suspect that if he were real, the Mexican government might be familiar with him. Additionally, Mayor Ernesto Bubion examined foot tracks around the city of Agua Prieta and expressed his deep belief that Sister Aimee had been released from a car, only 3 miles from town. However, just like the rest of this case, it's completely inconclusive. There were tire tracks, and there were footprints. There wasn't a prison shed in the middle of the desert, but there was an abandoned mining shack that could possibly fit Sister Aimee's vague description. The prosecution was convinced that no person could walk 20 miles in 100-degree weather, but a group of locals assured them that it was entirely possible. Everything about the case led back into itself like a house of cards. For every reasonable argument in favor of the prosecution, there was a reasonable argument against them. For every witness that saw Sister Aimee on the street corner of some random town or cottage, there were witnesses that swore under oath that those people couldn't have seen Sister Aimee. And to make matters worse, a number of very important pieces of evidence were lost during the investigation. The prosecution and defense were at a complete stalemate. So the prosecution dropped the case, and the ordeal was over. Sort of. The 1926 grand jury case, the largest of its kind in California, had hundreds of reporters and agencies looking for evidence against McPherson. Almost $500,000 was spent in total, an amount that would be around $7 million in today's money. And that's not including the dozens of reporters, journalists, and armchair detectives that spent thousands of their own dollars and years of their lives after the case was dismissed still trying to solve the mystery. Sister Aimee and Angelus Temple were also bathed in negative press. The papers spent years calling her every name in the book. They also accused her of all manner of crime and unsavory act. And all of the negative press caught up with her, eventually. Her ministry began to hemorrhage money. At one point, Angelus Temple was the subject of over 40 lawsuits simultaneously. It also lost some credibility due to Sister Aimee's controversial opinions about World War II and her insistence that Christians couldn't be pacifist, directly contradicting the teachings of Jesus. In the end, Sister Aimee was found by her son, dead of an overdose. Though most assert her death was an accident, just like the rest of her life, there is some mystery. You see, in addition to her normal prescriptions, there was an additional bottle of pills. One that had not been prescribed to her. And nobody could figure out where it came from. And so it is, just as mysteriously as she lived, she died. Likely an accident, though who's really to say what the truth is? All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate all of you a ton. If you would like to hear some of the interesting bits that I had to leave out of this episode, make sure that you subscribe to the premium content. You will not be disappointed. I don't have very many announcements this week, to be honest. I would love to have announcements, but I don't. So I have a couple of simple requests. If you like this episode, tell your friends about it. Post about it on social media, email it to them directly, send it in a text message, put it on a billboard, whatever you've got to do to spread the word is appreciated. That is the best way to help this show grow, is to proselytize my gospel. Just kidding. That's probably blasphemous, but it seemed thematic. So here's what you can do. All the People Pod on Twitter, because Twitter will not let you change your username. Obscure History Podcast on Instagram, because it will let you change your username. Or you can email directly at obscurehistorypod.com. I appreciate hearing from you guys. This is still and will likely always be an operation of one. I am my own PR department, my social media manager, writer, producer, researcher, the whole thing. It's just me. All by myself. So if you write anything or tag the show in any kind of social media post, I will absolutely see it, and I will almost certainly respond to you. Anyways, I've got to get out of here. I've got 1,000 things to do, and it is currently 11 p.m., and I've got work in the morning. So wish me luck. I will see you all next week.